Virginia, 1866. The war was over, but peace was a stranger to the hollows and hills of the Blue Ridge. The Confederacy had surrendered, and slavery had ended. But one secret remained, buried deeper than any grave beneath the ruins of a broken plantation. It was a secret that would soon ripple through the mountains, carried by whispers, fear, and a single, impossible truth. A former slave, carrying an extraordinary secret, was discovered to be with child. Whispers spread through the South like a wildfire. Some called it a miracle. Others called it an abomination. A few just called it proof that God worked in ways no human could ever understand. Then, something even more shocking happened. The very man who had once been the master of the plantation, the person who had once owned her, made a decision that would outrage an entire community and change both of their lives forever. Was it a story of redemption, deception, survival, or forbidden love? Stay with us until the very end, because every twist brings you closer to a truth no one saw coming. Welcome to the History Bank. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your state, the current time. It always amazes us to see how far our stories travel. If you enjoy true history and powerful, historical fiction inspired by the past, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story. Virginia, 1866. The war had ended, but the peace hadn't reached every hollow. Many plantations stood silent, their fields overgrown with weeds instead of tobacco and corn. Old masters struggled to accept a world without slavery. For them, the world had ended at Appomattox. For the formerly enslaved, the world was just beginning, a terrifying landscape of freedom without food, work, or shelter. Rumors traveled faster than a wagon could roll along a muddy road. Every town had a secret. Every family carried shame. Yet among all the whispered stories that crossed those Appalachian hills that year, none sounded stranger than the tale of a young person named Charity. Some called Charity a miracle. Others called her a curse. A few believed she was proof that God had created mysteries no man had the right to understand. The truth frightened everyone because no one could explain it. Charity had been born on a plantation many years earlier. The owner had hidden the child from visitors because the midwife had whispered that the baby was different. She told him the child possessed unusual physical characteristics that no one in the county had ever seen before. Fear spread through the household. The owner believed neighbors would mock his family if the child became known. Instead of allowing her to grow openly among the other children, he ordered that she remain close to the servants' quarters, away from strangers. Charity grew up doing the work expected of an enslaved girl. She cooked, cleaned, washed clothes, gathered eggs, hauled water, and looked after younger children. Yet she always noticed the curious looks from older women who exchanged worried glances whenever she bathed or changed clothes. No one answered her questions. They simply told her that God made every person for a reason. Those words never satisfied Charity, because children notice silence more clearly than words. As the years passed, Charity became known for her kindness rather than her anger. Whenever another enslaved child fell sick, she stayed beside them. Whenever an elderly worker collapsed in the fields, she quietly brought water and cooled their forehead. Even the hardest overseer admitted that Charity never complained. Yet, she often wondered why people stared before quickly looking away. After the war ended, everything changed. Yet, nothing truly changed. Freedom arrived on paper, but hunger remained real. Many former enslaved people had nowhere to go. Some stayed on plantations because leaving meant starvation. Charity remained as well, helping anyone who needed food or medicine. The former owner of the plantation, Thomas Whitmore, was no longer the powerful man he had once been. His fortune was nearly gone. Many of his workers had left forever. His large, white house stood proudly on the hill, but empty rooms echoed with loneliness. He'd lost his wife to a fever during the war. His only son had died at the Battle of the Wilderness. His servants were gone. His wealth had faded. Only his pride remained. One rainy evening, Thomas became trapped beneath a fallen wagon while returning home from town. The horse panicked and fled into the woods. The road was empty. Darkness was approaching. He shouted until his voice became weak. Hours passed before he heard footsteps. It was Charity. She had been gathering herbs near the creek. Without hesitation, she struggled against the heavy wood, her strength surprising even herself, until enough space opened for him to crawl free. The effort left her exhausted, breathing heavily on the muddy road. Thomas looked at the young former slave with surprise and shame. No one else had stopped. No one else had even heard him. Charity helped him walk back to the plantation, despite the heavy rain soaking them both. During that long walk, Thomas noticed something unusual. Charity moved with strength unlike most women of that time, but also possessed a remarkable gentleness. She spoke softly, never asking for reward. Upon reaching the house, he offered her payment. She refused. She simply smiled and returned to the small cabin where several freed families shared shelter. That night, Thomas Whitmore could not sleep. He kept remembering Charity's quiet courage. Days later, another strange event shook the plantation. A frightened child disappeared into the nearby forest. Wolves had been seen in the area. Searchers spread across the woods, calling the child's name until darkness returned. Many gave up, believing the child would never be found alive. Charity refused to stop searching. Guided only by broken branches and tiny footprints in the wet soil, she wandered deeper into the forest than anyone else dared travel. Hours later, she emerged, carrying the frightened child on her strong shoulders. The little girl clung tightly around Charity's neck, crying with relief. Everyone celebrated the rescue. Yet, while helping the exhausted child down, Charity suddenly staggered with pain. She pressed both hands against her stomach before pretending nothing had happened. Only an elderly woman named Hattie noticed. Hattie had served as the plantation midwife for decades. She had delivered nearly every child born on the estate. Her eyes widened with alarm. She quietly followed Charity later that evening. Inside the small cabin, Hattie finally spoke words she had kept buried for years. She reminded Charity about the unusual nature of her birth. She confessed that many secrets had been hidden to protect the child from fear and cruelty. Charity listened in silence, tears filling her tired eyes. Hattie explained that Charity had been born with a rare condition that confused everyone who witnessed the birth. Doctors had never examined the child because the owner feared public shame. Hattie admitted she never fully understood what she had seen, only that Charity deserved love like anyone else. Charity asked why no one had spoken sooner. Hattie answered with painful honesty. Fear controlled too many hearts. Charity forgave the old woman. She couldn't change the past. Several weeks later, Charity began feeling sick every morning. Food that once smelled pleasant now caused nausea. Fatigue grew worse every day. Hattie became concerned. She gently examined Charity and stepped backward with trembling hands. Her face turned pale. Charity demanded the truth. Hattie whispered something almost impossible. She believed Charity might be carrying a child. Charity laughed at first because the idea sounded ridiculous. Then she stopped laughing after seeing the terror in Hattie's eyes. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Silence filled the tiny cabin. Charity insisted Hattie must be mistaken. Hattie admitted she hoped she was wrong, yet every sign pointed toward pregnancy. Charity tried remembering every event during recent months. Confusion filled every thought. Nothing made sense. News traveled quickly among a few trusted friends, but they all agreed to keep silent until certainty arrived. Unfortunately, secrets rarely remain hidden for long in isolated rural areas. One afternoon, two women collecting water noticed Charity becoming ill beside the creek. They whispered to one another. By sunset, rumors had started spreading across the neighboring farms. Some claimed Charity had been cursed by spirits. Others insisted a traveling doctor had performed forbidden experiments years earlier. A preacher declared that only God knew the complete truth. Fear and curiosity grew together. Thomas heard the rumors during a visit to town. At first, he dismissed them as foolish gossip. Yet something inside urged him to discover the truth for himself. He visited Hattie that evening. The elderly woman refused to reveal private details. She only begged him not to allow cruel people to harm Charity. Thomas promised no harm would come while she remained near the plantation. That promise surprised even himself. Days later, a traveling physician arrived from a nearby county. Hattie secretly invited him to examine Charity. The physician spent several hours asking careful questions and performing a respectful examination with the limited medical knowledge of the time. When he finally stepped outside the cabin, his expression carried both wonder and uncertainty. He admitted he had encountered medical writings describing extremely rare conditions affecting human development, but he had never personally met such a patient. He also admitted that pregnancy under such circumstances would be considered extraordinarily unusual and difficult to explain with certainty. Charity listened quietly. The physician warned that the months ahead could become dangerous. She thanked him calmly, though inside every emotion battled together. Fear, hope, shame, confusion, and determination all refused to leave. As autumn approached, strangers began arriving near the plantation, hoping to glimpse the person everyone discussed in whispers. Some came out of compassion. Others came only to satisfy cruel curiosity. Children pointed, adults stared. Charity avoided crowds whenever possible. Thomas grew increasingly disturbed by the disrespect shown toward the person who had once saved his life. One afternoon, several drunken men rode onto the property, demanding to see Charity. They laughed loudly, calling her a monster, claiming they had traveled many miles just to witness the strange wonder everyone was talking about. Charity remained hidden inside Hattie's cabin, while frightened children cried nearby. Thomas stepped forward and ordered the men to leave. They mocked him for defending a former slave. Angry words quickly became pushing and shoving. One rider reached for his pistol before violence erupted. Then Charity walked calmly into the open yard. Complete silence fell. Every eye turned toward the quiet figure standing beneath the old oak tree. She looked directly at the strangers and spoke with remarkable courage. She said that every human being carried wounds invisible to others. Some wounds covered the body. Others lived inside the heart. She asked whether mocking another person's suffering ever healed anyone's own pain. The words struck harder than fists. Even the loudest rider lowered his eyes. Without another insult, the men climbed onto their horses and slowly departed. Thomas watched Charity with growing respect. That evening, he realized the strongest person on the plantation had never been its owner. It had always been the quiet soul everyone underestimated. Yet, as darkness settled across the Blue Ridge, another visitor approached from the distant road, carrying documents sealed with government wax and asking only one question. Where is the person called Charity? The stranger dismounted slowly before the large house. Dust covered his boots after many miles on rough Virginia roads. The leather case beneath his arm held several folded government papers marked with official seals. Thomas studied him carefully. The man appeared educated yet wary. His gray coat showed signs of long travel. His face carried neither cruelty nor kindness. It revealed only determination. Thomas asked the reason for such a visit. The stranger introduced himself as Judah Samuel Brooks, a physician working with officials who had recently begun recording unusual medical cases throughout the southern states. He explained that stories about Charity had spread across Virginia, West Virginia, and into Kentucky. At first, he believed they were nothing more than exaggerated gossip born from the hard times after the war. Then, several respected physicians wrote letters describing the same remarkable person. Curiosity had brought him to the plantation. Thomas hesitated before answering. He remembered his promise to Hattie that no harm would come to Charity. He told Judah Brooks that Charity was not an exhibit for public amusement. The doctor nodded respectfully and assured Thomas he sought only knowledge that might one day help others born with similar conditions. While they spoke, Hattie quietly watched from the doorway of her cabin. She understood that hiding forever would become impossible. Rumors always found new ears. Secrets always attracted strangers. She walked toward the two men with slow, careful steps and asked whether the doctor intended to treat Charity with dignity. Dr. Brooks removed his hat and answered that every patient deserved respect regardless of birth, color, or circumstance. Hattie searched his face for signs of dishonesty, but found none. She finally agreed to speak with Charity before allowing any examination. Charity listened carefully as Hattie explained the doctor's purpose. Fear remained. Yet another feeling slowly appeared beside it. Hope. For the first time, someone claimed to seek understanding instead of entertainment. She agreed to meet the visitor. Dr. Brooks entered the cabin alone. He greeted her politely and spent nearly an hour asking questions about her childhood, health, and recent changes. Unlike others who had stared with wide eyes, he never allowed surprise to replace compassion. He listened more than he spoke. When the conversation ended, the doctor admitted that medical science during that period possessed very limited knowledge about such rare conditions. He believed Charity had been born with characteristics that modern physicians struggled to explain. He also admitted that if she truly carried a child, the case would astonish doctors across the nation. Charity lowered her tired eyes and quietly asked whether such knowledge would make people kinder. Dr. Brooks could not answer. Before leaving, Dr. Brooks handed Charity a small notebook. He encouraged her to write down every physical change, every unusual feeling, every dream, and every fear. Someday, he said, those words might help another person who believes they are completely alone. Charity accepted the notebook with grateful hands. That night, she opened the first page and slowly began writing. Her education was limited, but every sentence carried honesty. She wrote about childhood confusion, lonely nights, whispered conversations abruptly ending whenever footsteps approached, and the desperate wish to understand why life felt different from everyone else's. Tears stained several pages before sleep finally came. The following morning, another surprise arrived. A young woman named Clara appeared on the plantation searching for work. Her father had died during the war. Her mother had recently passed away from fever. She had nowhere else to go. Thomas hired her to help restore the neglected house. Clara soon met Charity while gathering vegetables from the old garden. Unlike nearly everyone else, Clara never stared. She simply smiled and introduced herself. Charity found the kindness refreshing. During the following weeks, the two spent many afternoons talking while preparing meals for the hungry families who still remained on the land. Clara shared stories about losing everything during the war. Charity shared memories of growing up in silence. Friendship slowly replaced loneliness. One evening, Clara noticed Charity rubbing her sore back after carrying heavy buckets. She gently insisted Charity rest while she finished the work. Charity protested, but eventually agreed. As Clara lifted a bucket, she quietly asked whether the rumors were true. Charity froze. The silence lasted several moments. Then she answered that even after hearing the truth, many people refused to believe it. Clara simply replied that she cared more about the person than the rumors. Those simple words became one of the greatest gifts Charity had ever received. Meanwhile, Thomas found himself thinking about Charity more often than he wished to admit. At first, gratitude explained his concern. She had saved his life. She had rescued a lost child. She cared for sick neighbors without expecting payment. Yet another feeling gradually entered his heart. He admired her courage. He admired her compassion. He admired the quiet strength that never demanded attention. Such thoughts troubled him deeply. Society would never accept them. Former plantation owners were expected to rebuild old traditions, not question them. He struggled against emotions he barely understood. One afternoon, he rode into town to purchase supplies. Inside the general store, conversation suddenly stopped as he entered. Several men exchanged knowing smiles. One laughed and asked whether the stories about his unusual former slave were true. Another joked that perhaps Thomas planned to charge admission to curious visitors. Laughter filled the room. Thomas felt anger rising. He answered firmly that Charity was a human being deserving of respect. The laughter faded. An older farmer stepped forward and warned Thomas that defending her could destroy whatever reputation he had left after the war. He left without another word. Yet those warnings echoed throughout the long ride home. Back on the plantation, Charity noticed Thomas seemed unusually quiet. She asked whether something troubled him. Thomas almost confessed everything, but stopped himself. Instead, he thanked her once again for saving his life. Charity smiled gently and reminded him that every life held equal value. The answer lingered inside his thoughts long after their conversation ended. As the weeks passed, Charity's condition became increasingly difficult to hide. The growing changes within her body confirmed Hattie's earlier suspicions. Dr. Brooks returned for another examination. His concern deepened. He explained that childbirth under ordinary circumstances already carried great danger during that period. Charity's unique condition increased every possible risk. He recommended traveling to a larger city like Richmond, where better medical facilities might exist. Unfortunately, such a journey required money that no one possessed. Winter approached quickly. Travel would become even more dangerous. Charity quietly declared that whatever happened would happen on the plantation, surrounded by people who truly cared. Hattie supported the decision. Clara promised never to leave her alone. Thomas secretly arranged for extra blankets, fresh food, and medicines to be delivered whenever possible. One cold evening, Charity walked alone toward the old cemetery overlooking the fields. Hundreds of simple graves rested beneath weathered trees. Many belonged to enslaved people whose names had never been carved upon stones. She knelt before one unmarked grave believed to belong to the woman who had given birth to her before dying only days later. "I never knew your face," she whispered, "but I hope you know I tried to become someone kind. I hope you would not be ashamed of me." Tears flowed freely as evening shadows stretched across the silent ground. Unknown to Charity, Thomas had followed from a distance. He heard every word. His own eyes filled with tears as he realized how completely she had grown without a mother's embrace, without answers, without certainty about the future. At that moment, he understood that his feelings had become something deeper than gratitude. He loved Charity. The realization frightened him because he knew the world would never understand. Several days later, disaster struck. A fire erupted inside one of the storage barns after a lantern fell onto dry hay. Strong winds pushed flames toward nearby cabins where several children slept. Panic spread instantly. People shouted. Mothers screamed. Buckets of water seemed useless against the growing blaze. Before anyone could stop the flames, Charity rushed directly into the smoke after hearing frightened cries. Clara tried desperately to pull her back, reminding her about the pregnancy. But Charity disappeared inside the burning building. Seconds felt like hours. Burning beams cracked overhead. Thick smoke poured through every opening. Then she emerged, carrying one child beneath each arm, while another clung tightly around her neck. The rescued children coughed violently but remained alive. As Charity reached safety, the burning roof collapsed behind them with a thunderous crash. Everyone stared in amazement. She smiled weakly before collapsing upon the frozen ground. Hattie and Dr. Brooks hurried forward. Charity regained consciousness several minutes later, but complained of sharp pain deep within her body. Fear filled every face. Dr. Brooks examined her immediately and ordered complete bed rest. He warned that another shock of such intensity could threaten both her and the unborn child. Night settled quietly across the plantation after the fire had finally been extinguished. Families gathered together, offering prayers of gratitude. Thomas stood alone outside the cabin where Charity rested. He knew he could no longer hide his feelings. Whether the world approved or condemned him no longer mattered. Tomorrow he would speak the truth to her. Yet neither Thomas nor anyone else noticed a lone rider watching the plantation from a distant hill beneath the pale moonlight. The stranger carried a folded newspaper with Charity's story on the front page. A cruel smile slowly spread across his face. He whispered that unusual people could earn a fortune for the right buyer. Then he turned his horse toward the plantation and disappeared into the darkness, carrying plans that would soon place every life upon the estate in terrible danger. Morning arrived beneath a gray Virginia sky. The smoke from the burned barn still drifted across the plantation. Families worked quietly to clear the blackened wood, while Charity rested inside Hattie's cabin. The pain from the previous evening had lessened, but everyone understood that danger still remained. Dr. Samuel Brooks stayed another day to observe her condition. He reminded everyone that too much stress could place both her and the child at greater risk. Charity thanked him for his concern, but admitted that peace seemed impossible while strangers continued arriving because of rumors. Dr. Brooks nodded sadly. He had witnessed the same problem in other places. Whenever people feared what they did not understand, curiosity often became cruelty. Thomas spent the morning helping repair damaged fences. Yet his thoughts never left Charity. He remembered the moment she had rushed into the burning barn without thinking about personal safety. Many people spoke proudly about courage, but Charity had simply lived it. Thomas realized that every lesson he believed he had learned about honor before the war had been incomplete. The person who had taught him the greatest truths had once been treated as property. That realization filled him with shame. Shortly before noon, a horse approached the plantation road. The rider wore an expensive dark coat and a polished hat. His appearance differed greatly from the farmers who usually visited the area. Behind him followed another wagon, carrying several large trunks. The man smiled broadly as he climbed down from his horse. He introduced himself as Horace Bell. He claimed to be a businessman from further north, who had heard extraordinary stories about Charity. Thomas asked the purpose of the visit. Horace answered without embarrassment. He explained that people across the country paid money to witness unusual individuals. He spoke about traveling exhibitions, crowded halls, and fortunes earned by displaying rare human conditions. He proudly claimed that Charity could become famous. Thomas's expression hardened immediately. He ordered Horace to leave the plantation. Horace laughed softly and replied that poverty often changed people's minds. He reminded Thomas that the plantation was struggling financially. He offered a large amount of money in exchange for convincing Charity to travel with him for only 1 year. Horace insisted Charity would receive fine clothing, comfortable lodging, and public admiration. Thomas stepped closer until only a few inches separated them. He answered that Charity was free and no amount of money would ever purchase another human being on that land. Horace's smile slowly disappeared. He climbed back onto his horse, but before leaving, he quietly warned Thomas that not everyone respected freedom as much as he did. The wagon disappeared down the dusty road, leaving behind an uneasy silence. Hattie had watched the conversation from a distance. She whispered that such men never accepted refusal easily. That evening, Thomas gathered everyone living on the plantation. He described Horace's visit and urged every family to remain watchful. Several men volunteered to take turns guarding the cabins throughout the night. Clara remained beside Charity, refusing to leave for a moment. Charity listened quietly, while others discussed possible danger. Finally, she spoke. She said that hiding forever would not solve the problem. Sooner or later, another stranger would arrive. Another rumor would spread. Another person would attempt to profit from fear. Dr. Brooks agreed. He believed that education remained the only lasting answer. But education required time, and time was the one thing danger rarely offered. During the following week, Charity continued writing in the notebook Judar Brooks had given her. The pages became filled with memories. She described learning to read from torn pages, secretly shared by an elderly preacher. She described the first time freedom had been announced, and how joy had mixed with confusion, because no one knew where to go next. She wrote about wondering whether people born different would ever truly belong anywhere. Clara often sat nearby while Charity wrote. One afternoon, she quietly admitted she admired Charity more than anyone she had ever known. Charity smiled and replied that courage often looked larger from a distance than it felt inside the heart. Clara answered that true courage usually belonged to those who doubted themselves, but continued walking anyway. Those words remained with Charity for many days. Meanwhile, Thomas traveled to a nearby town seeking additional supplies. Inside the courthouse, he unexpectedly met a lawyer named Samuel Pierce, a man who had once represented wealthy plantation owners before the war. Samuel greeted him politely before asking whether the rumors about Charity were true. Thomas replied that Charity deserved privacy. Samuel lowered his voice and explained that unusual legal questions might soon arise. Freedom had changed many laws, but confusion still surrounded marriage, inheritance, and property rights involving formerly enslaved people. Thomas listened carefully. Samuel admitted that courts throughout the South continued struggling to interpret new laws fairly. As Thomas rode home that afternoon, another realization settled heavily upon his mind. If he truly intended to tell Charity about his feelings, the decision would affect far more than his own future. Society would judge them harshly. Friends would abandon him. Former allies would call him a traitor. Yet, every mile carried him closer to the same conclusion. None of those fears outweighed the respect and affection growing inside his heart. Late that evening, Thomas walked toward Hattie's cabin. The moon shone brightly above the fields. Crickets sang from the tall grass. He paused outside the door, gathering courage. Before he could knock, Charity stepped outside, carrying a small lantern. Surprise crossed both faces. She asked if something was wrong. He answered quietly that he wished to speak honestly. They walked together beneath the old oak tree, where so many important conversations had already taken place. Thomas admitted that saving his life had changed him forever. At first, he believed gratitude explained everything he felt. Then he realized the truth reached much deeper. He admired her kindness, wisdom, courage, and compassion. He confessed that he had fallen in love. Silence followed. Charity looked toward the distant fields where tobacco once grew beneath forced labor. Finally, she spoke. She thanked Thomas for his honesty, but reminded him that the world outside the plantation remained filled with hatred. She asked whether he understood what people would say. Thomas answered that he had spent much of his life worrying about the opinions of others. The war had shown him how quickly pride could become meaningless. Charity lowered her gentle eyes. She admitted that no one had ever spoken those words with sincerity before. Every earlier kindness had carried hidden conditions. Every earlier compliment had expected something in return. Thomas simply waited. He demanded nothing. At last, Charity whispered that fear remained stronger than hope. Thomas replied that he would rather spend one truthful day beside her than a lifetime pretending to be someone else. Before Charity could answer, a loud shout echoed from the far side of the plantation. One of the night guards came running toward them. Several horses had been spotted near the tree line. Lanterns moved through the darkness. Thomas immediately ordered everyone inside the cabins, while a few trusted men gathered old hunting rifles. The approaching riders stopped just beyond the property. For several tense minutes, neither side moved. Then one rider called out that they had simply lost the road. Thomas didn't believe the explanation, but neither did he wish to begin violence without certainty. After a long silence, the strangers finally turned away and disappeared into the woods. Hattie quietly whispered that Horace Bell had not forgotten them. The following morning, Gerd Brooks prepared to leave. Before departing, he handed Thomas a sealed letter addressed to a respected physician in Richmond. He explained that if Charity's condition suddenly worsened, the letter might persuade the hospital to provide immediate assistance, despite the unusual circumstances. Thomas thanked him sincerely. Dr. Brooks then approached Charity and said that whatever happened, she should never believe that being different reduced her human worth. Science often needed many years to understand what had always existed. Charity smiled with grateful eyes. As the doctor's carriage disappeared along the road, an uneasy feeling settled across the plantation. Days passed without another visitor. The quiet almost seemed suspicious. Then, just before sunset several evenings later, Clara entered Charity's cabin carrying a newspaper she had obtained from town. The front page contained a large headline describing the mysterious pregnant former slave living near the Blue Ridge Mountains. The article exaggerated every rumor, inventing impossible details and encouraging readers to visit Virginia to witness what it called the greatest curiosity in the South. Charity slowly folded the newspaper without speaking. Tears gathered silently. Clara placed an arm around her shoulders. Outside the cabin, Thomas read the same article. His hands trembled with anger. He suddenly understood that the danger facing Charity had become far greater than one dishonest businessman. The entire country was beginning to hear the story. Unknown faces would soon arrive from every direction. Some would seek knowledge. Some would seek money. Others would seek cruelty. And among them, Horace Bell was already preparing his next move, convinced that if persuasion failed, there were darker methods capable of delivering Charity into his hands. The newspaper spread faster than anyone expected. Within days, copies reached nearby counties. Travelers carried the story into busy towns, river ports, and railroad stations. Every new reader added another version, until the truth became almost impossible to separate from imagination. Some claimed Charity possessed supernatural powers. Others insisted the story was invented. A few believed the article enough to begin traveling toward the plantation. Every wagon seen upon the distant road caused fresh concern among the families living there. Thomas ordered stronger watches during the night. No one complained. Everyone understood that danger had become real. Charity remained inside the cabin more often, spending quiet hours writing in Dudar, Brooks's notebook. The pages now contained memories, prayers, questions, and hopes that no one else had ever heard. Hattie sometimes read the entries aloud because she wanted another voice to carry the words into the room. Each sentence reminded everyone that behind every rumor stood a living person with fears and dreams. One cool morning, Thomas rode into town for supplies. The streets felt different. Conversations stopped whenever he entered a shop. Several people looked at him with open suspicion. Others whispered behind his back. At the general store, an elderly merchant quietly warned him that strangers had been asking detailed questions about the plantation, the number of people living there, and the easiest road leading to the property. Thomas thanked the merchant and returned home before sunset. He gathered everyone together and explained what he had learned. The mood became serious. Several former Union soldiers who now worked nearby volunteered to help protect the plantation if trouble came. They understood that freedom meant little if people still lived in fear. Thomas accepted their offer with gratitude. That evening, Charity walked slowly toward the old oak tree. Thomas joined her. Neither spoke for several minutes. The wind moved gently through the branches above them. Finally, Charity broke the silence. She admitted that ever since the newspaper appeared, sleep had become difficult. Every sound outside the cabin felt like approaching footsteps. Every barking dog sounded like a warning. Thomas promised again that no one would take her against her will. Charity looked into his eyes and quietly asked whether he truly understood what standing beside her would cost. Thomas answered without hesitation. He said he had already counted the cost and still believed that truth carried greater value than public approval. Charity's eyes filled with tears. For the first time since childhood, hope felt stronger than fear. Before another word could be spoken, Clara hurried toward them, carrying a folded letter. A rider had delivered it only moments earlier before quickly leaving. Thomas opened the envelope. Inside rested a single sheet of paper. It was a warning, stating that refusing Horace Bell's offer had been a costly mistake. It claimed that Charity would soon belong to people who understood the value of rare wonders. The letter ended with a promise that no law would stop what had already begun. Thomas folded the paper slowly. He refused to let Charity read the threat, but she saw the worry upon his face. Hattie insisted that everyone move into the large house for greater safety. The thick walls offered better protection than the small cabins. Families gathered blankets and food before nightfall. Children slept together inside one room, while adults remained awake, taking turns watching every window. Midnight arrived quietly. Then one of the guards heard horses. The sound grew louder until several riders emerged from the darkness. Lantern light reflected from their faces. They stopped beyond the front gate. One rider called Thomas by name and demanded that Charity be surrendered peacefully. Thomas stepped onto the porch holding an old rifle. Several former soldiers stood beside him. He answered that every person on the property was free and no one would be handed over. The riders laughed. One warned that they greatly outnumbered those defending the house. Another lifted a burning torch. Before anyone could move further, a familiar voice echoed from behind the riders. Dr. Samuel Brooks had returned unexpectedly with 2 county deputies after receiving reports that armed men planned to seize Charity. The deputies ordered the riders to leave immediately. Horace Bell slowly rode forward from among them. His pleasant smile had disappeared completely. He stared at Thomas with open hatred before turning his horse away. One by one, the others followed. The danger passed, but no one believed the matter was truly over. Dr. Brooks explained that he had learned of Horace's activities while traveling. Similar attempts had reportedly been made against other vulnerable people who were displayed for profit in different parts of the country. He feared Charity had become the next target. Thomas thanked him for returning. Dr. Brooks admitted that his conscience had given him little choice. During the following days, he remained on the plantation. He examined Charity again and noticed the pregnancy had progressed further. He warned everyone that the coming weeks would require constant care. Hattie prepared clean linens and herbal remedies while Clara organized the room where Charity would remain. Every person contributed something. Some chopped firewood. Others gathered fresh water. Children collected wildflowers to brighten the room. Charity watched these quiet acts of kindness with gratitude. One afternoon, Dr. Brooks asked permission to read Charity's notebook. She agreed. After several hours, he closed the final page with moist eyes. He confessed that medical books describe conditions, symptoms, and anatomy, but they never described loneliness. Charity's words had taught him something no lecture ever could. He asked whether he might someday share the notebook with other physicians. After removing her name, Charity agreed only if the purpose remained compassion rather than curiosity. Dr. Brooks gave his word. That evening, Thomas again asked Charity whether hope had room to grow despite everything happening around them. She looked toward the families working together outside the house. People who once had every reason to distrust one another now shared food, labor, and protection. She smiled softly and answered that perhaps hope grew strongest in difficult ground. Thomas gently reached for her hand. This time, Charity did not pull away. Several days later, Samuel Pierce, the lawyer Thomas had met in town, arrived carrying legal documents. He explained that Virginia law after the war remained confused in many areas. Yet there existed nothing preventing two free adults from seeking marriage, if they willingly entered the union and met the legal requirements of the county. Samuel warned that public reaction would likely be severe, but the law itself offered more protection than many expected. Thomas thanked him. After Samuel departed, he asked Charity to walk once more beneath the old oak tree. There, with only the evening sky above them, he spoke from the heart. He said he did not offer marriage out of pity, duty, or gratitude. He offered it because he had come to love her courage, wisdom, kindness, and unwavering belief in the value of every human life. Charity stood silent for a long moment. Tears slowly rolled down her cheeks. She admitted that love had always seemed like something meant for other people, never for someone surrounded by whispers and suspicion. Thomas answered that whispers disappeared with time, but truth remained. Charity finally whispered one word. Yes. Joy spread across the plantation when the news became known. Hattie embraced Charity with tears. Clara laughed and cried at the same time. Even Dr. Brooks smiled warmly. Yet beyond the fields, another pair of eyes watched from a distant ridge. Horace Bell lowered the small spyglass through which he had witnessed the celebration. Rage burned within him. He had failed to purchase her. He had failed to frighten Thomas. Now he swore that if the wedding took place, It would happen only after he had made one final attempt to claim the person he believed would make him rich. As thunder rolled across the distant Virginia sky and dark clouds gathered above the plantation, no one realized that the greatest test of courage still waited just ahead. Dawn arrived beneath heavy clouds that covered the Virginia sky. The plantation stood unusually quiet. Everyone sensed that something important would happen before another sunset. Thomas and Charity had agreed to marry before a small gathering of friends who had stood beside them through fear and hardship. Hattie rose before sunrise to prepare a simple meal. Clara gathered fresh wildflowers from the fields and placed them inside glass jars around the old house. Dr. Nathaniel Brooks remained at the plantation because Charity's condition required constant attention. Samuel Pierce also returned, carrying the legal papers that would officially record the marriage. Although the celebration would be small, every person present understood they were witnessing something that few people in that part of the country would have imagined possible. Only a few years earlier, Charity stood quietly beside the bedroom window, looking across the fields. Those same fields had once represented pain, fear, and forced labor. Today, they represented survival. She whispered a quiet prayer, asking God to give her strength for whatever waited beyond that day. Thomas entered the room carrying a small wooden box. Inside rested a simple wedding band that had belonged to his late mother. It was not decorated with expensive jewels. Time had worn its surface smooth. Thomas explained that his mother had once told him that love became stronger through sacrifice rather than wealth. Charity accepted the ring with trembling hands. Tears filled both their eyes as they realized how far their lives had traveled from the days when they first knew one another, only as master and enslaved worker. Outside the house, several children laughed while helping decorate the porch with flowers. Their laughter brought comfort to every adult, because it reminded them that a new generation might grow without chains. Shortly before noon, the guests gathered beneath the old oak tree, where Thomas had first confessed his love. Hattie stood beside Charity. Clara smiled proudly while holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. Dr. Brooks and Samuel Pierce waited quietly nearby. Just as Samuel opened the legal papers, the sound of galloping horses echoed across the fields. Every face turned toward the road. Horace Bell appeared with several armed men riding behind him. Their horses stopped only a short distance from the gathering. Horace climbed down slowly, his face filled with anger rather than the false politeness he had shown during his first visit. He declared that Charity belonged with people who would appreciate such a rare person. He insisted that money had already been promised by wealthy businessmen, eager to display her before paying crowds. Thomas stepped forward and calmly answered that Charity belonged to no one except God, and to the future she freely chose. Horace laughed bitterly and ordered his men forward. Before they could move farther, several familiar faces emerged from behind the barns. The former Union soldiers, who had promised to help defend the plantation, had returned. County deputies also rode through the front gate after receiving Samuel Pierce's warning that another attack might occur. Horace suddenly realized his plan had failed. Still refusing to surrender, he drew a pistol and rushed toward Charity. Thomas stepped between them. During the struggle, the pistol discharged into the air. The loud report frightened the horses. Horace lost his balance and fell heavily to the ground. The deputies quickly restrained him, and the remaining men surrendered without further resistance. As Horace was led away, he shouted that the world would never accept Charity. She answered calmly that acceptance began with choosing kindness instead of fear. Horace lowered his eyes and said nothing more. Peace slowly returned to the plantation. Samuel Pierce unfolded the marriage papers once again. Beneath the old oak tree, surrounded by people who had become family through shared hardship, Thomas and Charity exchanged their vows. They promised to honor one another through every joy and every trial. When Thomas gently placed his mother's ring upon Charity's finger, many people quietly wiped tears from their faces. Hattie smiled through her own tears because she remembered the frightened child hidden from strangers so many years earlier. She had never imagined living long enough to witness such a moment. Life settled into a quieter rhythm during the following weeks. Charity continued to rest while Dr. Brooks carefully monitored every change. Thomas spent his days repairing the farm alongside the freed families who had chosen to remain as paid workers and partners. The plantation slowly transformed into a community built upon cooperation instead of slavery. The work remained difficult, yet people labored with hope rather than fear. One stormy evening, Charity's labor began. Heavy rain struck the roof, while thunder rolled across the dark sky. Hattie and Dr. Brooks remained beside her throughout the long night. Clara stayed close, offering comfort whenever pain became overwhelming. Thomas waited outside the room, praying more earnestly than ever before. The hours passed slowly. Just before sunrise, the cries of a newborn filled the house. Relief spread through every room. Dr. Brooks stepped outside carrying a gentle smile. He announced that Charity had survived the difficult birth, and that the child was alive. The delivery had been dangerous, but through remarkable strength, careful medical attention, and God's mercy, both mother and baby had come safely through the ordeal. Thomas entered quietly and found Charity holding the sleeping infant close. Charity smiled with exhausted eyes. Thomas knelt beside the bed, overcome with gratitude. They chose a name that symbolized hope for the future, because they wanted the child to grow in a world better than the one they had inherited. News of the successful birth spread throughout nearby communities. This time, many newspapers reported the story with greater respect after speaking with Dr. Brooks and Samuel Pierce. Dr. Brooks never allowed exaggerated claims to replace compassion. Instead, he explained that every human life deserved dignity regardless of differences that science did or did not yet understand. Charity never sought fame. Invitations from cities across the country arrived, offering money for interviews and public appearances. Every offer received the same polite answer. She preferred a peaceful life, helping neighbors rather than becoming an object of endless curiosity. Dr. Brooks eventually published medical observations without revealing her identity. More importantly, he included lessons about treating every patient with humanity before judgment. Young physicians later read those words and carried that attitude into their own practice. Thomas and Charity devoted much of their remaining years to building a small school where children of every background could learn together. They believed education broke chains that violence never could. Clara became one of the first teachers. Hattie lived long enough to watch children fill the classroom with laughter before peacefully passing away. Surrounded by people who loved her, she left the world knowing the child she had protected for so many years had finally found a home where fear no longer ruled. As seasons passed, visitors occasionally stopped beside the old oak tree after hearing stories about the unusual couple who had challenged the prejudices of their time. Some arrived seeking sensational tales. Most departed carrying a different lesson. They learned that courage rarely appeared with loud speeches. More often it appeared in quiet acts of compassion, forgiveness, and steadfast love. Charity never believed life had become perfect. Painful memories remained. Harsh opinions never disappeared completely. Yet she also learned that one person's kindness could begin changing many hearts. Thomas often said that the greatest freedom he discovered after the war was not political or financial. It was learning to see another human being without the blindness of pride. Their story became part of local memory, passed from one generation to another. Not because it answered every question, but because it reminded people that dignity belongs to every person. And long after the old plantation had become peaceful farmland, and the oak tree had grown even taller, neighbors still told their children that the strongest people were not always the loudest or the wealthiest. Sometimes they were simply the ones who chose compassion when fear would have been easier. That was the legacy Charity left behind, a legacy that outlived rumors, hatred, and even time itself. Charity's story reminds us that history is not only shaped by kings, presidents, generals, or wealthy landowners. It is also shaped by ordinary people who choose courage over fear, compassion over hatred, and hope over despair. Even when the world refused to understand her, Charity refused to let bitterness define her life. She answered cruelty with kindness, rejection with dignity, and uncertainty with unwavering faith. Together, she and Thomas proved that true freedom is not only the breaking of chains, but also the courage to see the humanity in one another. Their legacy lived on through the children they raised, the lives they touched, and the community they helped rebuild. Long after their voices had fallen silent, the lessons of their lives continued to echo across generations, reminding everyone that love, respect, and compassion possess a power far greater than prejudice. Thank you for joining us on this journey through another powerful story on the History Bank. If this story moved you, inspired you, or gave you something to think about, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the History Bank, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next historical story. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your state, and the current time there. We love reading your comments and seeing viewers from around the world. Share this story with your family and friends so that together we can keep history alive, one remarkable story at a time. Until our next journey into the past.